Hello, everybody. Welcome to today's interview at CESI Talks. These are a series of interviews we are conducting in the frame of a project which is called WEP24, and it's about informing our members about the flaws, but mainly also the benefits of the European Union. And I'm very happy and proud to be today with Sara Cerdas from the S&D Group, member of the European Parliament, of course, from Portugal, and member, among others, of the ENVI Committee on the Environment, Public Health and Food Safety, and the Subcommittee on Public Health. Ms. Cerdas, welcome.
Thank you. Thank you for having me here. It's a pleasure.
Cerdas, we just discussed, I just came across an article, stating that the International Energy Agency said that in 2022, 90 billion euros were invested in fossil fuels on the European continent. You have been a rapporteur, also a shadow rapporteur on a file on CO2 emission performance standards for cars. What is the EU doing to reduce CO2 emissions, and is it doing enough?
Yes, the EU is doing a lot. I think the question, is it doing enough? You can see a clear divide between the progressive groups and those more conservative groups. So our main goal with the European Union is to reach our climate law objectives, which is to reduce by 55% our emissions by 2030 and be climate neutral by 2050. How are we doing this? Through a set of regulations and legislation. What does this mean? It's the biggest legislative package. So it's going to change the way we're going to live and work, and all of this, it's called the transition. In this transition, for my political group, it's of the utmost importance that it's just. So if you work in a very polluting, high emission job, that you get requalified and that you don't lose your job position. Why is this important? Because emissions of CO2 and other greenhouse effect gas are the main drivers for the increase of temperatures in the planet, global temperatures. And this is the main driver for climate change consequences that we're all actually living through them at the moment. So how are we doing this? What does this legislation mean? This is legislation on the environment, climate, and biodiversity. So I would like to highlight three important regulations that we have in this overall package of 27 regulations and legislations and files. One is the regulation on the CO2 emission for cars and vans, which, as you stated, I was the shadow rapporteur, meaning I was negotiating on behalf of my political group. What did we meant by this? We aim to, by 2035, all new vehicles that are sold in the EU to be zero transmission at the pipeline, at the pipe. So what does this mean? That until 2035, we're going to have a set of targets that all the new cars in the EU need to be less pollutant. Why is 2035 a key date for us? Because we have that the life cycle of a car or one of these vehicles is usually around 15 years. So if you have all new cars being less pollutant by 2035, you're going to have the majority of the fleet being non-pollutant by 2050. But we also have other big regulations, such as the emission trading system that covers the sectors of electricity and energy and commercial aviation. And the main goal is to drive these industries on how to reduce their emissions. This is in the EU. What are we doing to... The EU cannot be a sole player here. So we also have regulation such as the carbon border adjustment mechanism, which creates incentives for non-European Union producers to reduce their emissions. So it's a set of proposals to revise and update existing EU law to make sure that it's in line with the EU goals, and those that have their industry in the EU can also reduce those emissions.
Ms. Cerdas, you mentioned it. We are in the midst of a transition which is supposed to happen in all different sectors and industries. You also mentioned the new standards for cars. We represent also workers in the automotive industry. We know it's not going to be a walk in the park. What are the difficulties for the member states in the implementation of the Green Deal, according to you?
What are the difficulties? Yeah, there's many difficulties. First and foremost is how difficult this transition is, and also to inform citizens on what it means. But it's not a transition that needs to be driven by citizens. We need to address the most polluting sectors. So everybody needs to set their part. We cannot do it alone, so we need to very important international cooperation to achieve the Paris Agreement. We need to have greater efforts on addressing and informing about this issue, raising awareness. The current younger generations are very much aware of this, but perhaps this is not something felt across generations. And also one of the biggest difficulties will also be the next year composition of the parliament. Currently, we're just by a tiny bit majority, we can pass legislation. Next week, we're going to have the natural restoration law, and for instance, is to restore our biodiversity ecosystems in order for them to be carbon absorbers. So if we have healthy ecosystems, we emit less. Very simply stating, what does this mean? It's very important that we recover ecosystems in the EU, as 80% of our ecosystems are in a bad state. However, the more right-wing groups led by European People's Party are against this regulation by a political caprice, if one can say. They're already having their internal discussions on next year's elections, and the legislation is getting hit as a side deal, and it should not be that. We need to be focused until the end of this mandate and also the beginning of the next one, obviously, to approve as much legislation that we can, because we're talking about reaching our goals by 2030, which is just around the corner. Is less than 7 years to that. It's 6 years and a few, so it goes in an instant. And as we see, we have been let's say shaken up by different crises during the last 4 years, such as pandemic, obviously a war, and the socioeconomic crisis. So we above in the bag with all of this, we have one constant crisis, which is the climate emergency. And for that, we must not lose focus, and we must not let our internal divergences to hit these bigger pieces of legislation that we're actually here as a parliament to represent the citizens. We're not here to work or go on those political gains.
Cerdas, we were also, of course, following the works in the European Parliament, and I must say, it has been quite impressive altogether what the European Parliament brought on the way. Also, of course, and the proposal from the European Commission. You mentioned it next year, the European elections. What would be your message for these upcoming elections to the citizens?
My message is very simple: be informed and go to vote. In Portugal, last elections, only 1 in every 3 voters went to vote. 1 in 3, whereas EU legislation influences Portuguese legislation by 2/3. So can you imagine how two out of 3 voters, they just didn't choose their representatives for the parliament? So my main message is that go and please vote, and vote in those after you scrutinize. I know sometimes it's also difficult, but if after you scrutinize their programs and what they defend, vote in those that most likely will defend your values, your ideas, but also your convictions, especially when it comes to green transition. And here, just as a note, that this transition cannot be done just with green measures, nor can it be done just protecting the industry. It needs to be a balanced transition. It needs to be a green transition, but with social justice in its heart, because it's of the utmost importance that we don't leave anyone behind. And meaning a lot of things are going to change, but ensure that those in most vulnerable groups, those that are having to change their jobs, they are not left behind, and that's the most important thing for us.
Ms. Cerdas, all the best to you also in view of the upcoming elections. Thank you very much for the interview, for your time, and have a good day.
You too. Bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.